Everyone has heard the story of how Gambino boss John Gotti was finally brought to justice. In one form or another, the plot basically goes as follows. The FBI bugged an apartment above the Ravenite social club, in which Gotti was overheard and recorded talking, specifically regarding the structure of the family and, more crucially, about murders. Consequently, he and his administration were arrested, his underboss flipped, and he was convicted after a trial, and that was the end of John Gotti. I believe it's one of the most repeated stories in the history of the mob. In May 2022, the lead prosecutor in Gotti's final trial, John Gleason, published a book called The Gotti Wars, which details the events from a prosecution and law enforcement viewpoint of how they took down John Gotti. Considering all the content that's ever been made regarding Gotti's demise, the one unanswered question is who disclosed the details of the apartment used by Gotti and his administration. Let's get into it. Law enforcement on both state and federal levels have tried unsuccessfully to prosecute Gotti going back to the 80s. In 1985, following the murder of Paul Castellano, Gotti became known to law enforcement as the new boss of the Gambino family. And it was at that point he was awarded with law enforcement's largest bullseye. The target that was previously assigned to him was widened to one specifically aimed at bosses, the government's largest targets. And it's safe to say, out of all the bosses walking around back then, Gotti was the main focus of the government. The explanation for this can be found in two schools of thought. First, the media's fascination with Gotti brought tremendous attention to him. And in all fairness, Gotti didn't go out pursuing the media. Conversely, they stalked him. However, he also by no means attempted to shield himself from the cameras. He often smiled and offered witty one-liners, all of which makes a person more appealing to the media. But to say this was his downfall would be minimizing the crimes he was responsible for. So the accurate wording would be that by courting the media, he paved the way to his own downfall. Nothing enrages the government more than the public viewing a villain as a hero. As an example, one being filmed giving money to the homeless. John Gotti stepped up in the world of organized crime as a boss with the big splash. And ironically, it's precisely how the government intended to convict him, also with a big splash. The Ravenite Social Club was located at 247 Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, and was the original headquarters of Neil Della Croce. Following Della Croce's death in December 1985 and Paul Castellano's murder 2 weeks later, John Gotti switched his headquarters from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, to the Ravenite. At the time, the FBI had a command post in an apartment up the block, which only offered them surveillance photos and videos of who was coming and going at the club. The FBI tried bugging the club in the past, but the device they installed was detected. It was noted that the acoustics inside the club was terrible. The Gambino Squad C-16, under the supervision of Bruce Mao, decided to put all their efforts and resources into getting John Gotti. As mentioned, there were a number of cases he was acquitted of, earning him the nickname the Teflon Don, which further enraged the government. One of the strongest tools at the FBI's disposal are the confidential informants, and the Gambino family, like any other family, are replete with guys supplying the FBI with information for a monthly payday. One of those sources offered information that on occasion, Gotti would walk across the railroad-style club towards a back door, which led out to a hallway and the rest of the three-story building. But similar to the club, the acoustics in the hallway were not good either. Guys in the club obviously witnessed Gotti summoning people to speak out in the hallway, but most likely didn't know that from time to time, he would walk up a staircase to apartment number 10, which belonged to Nettie Sorelli, the widow of Gambino member Mike Sorelli, and where Gotti would have his clandestine meetings. The C-16 Gambino squad was able to get a federal judge to sign off on a pen register which records the records from a specific phone line. In this case, that would be Mrs. Sorelli's house phone. In November 1989, after agents monitored the pen register, no outgoing or incoming calls were taking place from the Sorelli household, which meant that Mrs. Sorelli wasn't home. Naturally, the agents also received a judge's order to place a bug in Mrs. Sorelli's apartment. And late one night, They entered 247 Mulberry Street, went up the staircase, and picked the lock on apartment 10. After entering the apartment, they installed a bug in a lamp in the living room, where the acoustics would prove to be very good for relaying audio. According to John Gleason, who became the chief prosecutor in what would be John Gotti's final trial, a confidential informant, one close to Gotti, gave up the apartment above the club. But there are many theories about how the Sorelli apartment became known as a meeting place. I even posed the question in a community post where several people suggested that it was Joe the Cat Lafort, who actually owned the building and was a Gambino member, one who goes back with Della Croce for years. Personally, I don't believe he was an informant. Other people suggested it was Willie Boy Johnson, but Willie Boy had been out of the picture for years, since around 1985, and was killed in 1988. And others believe no one gave up the apartment and that the agents figured it out on their own. In Gleason's book, he did mention that agents heard Gotti's voice in the hall, but that he soon trailed off. Please remember to like this video if you haven't liked it already, as it helps with the algorithm. And for anyone who wants to show their appreciation, or more importantly, help keep this podcast going, you can do so by the Super Thanks icon down below, or the PayPal Cash App links in the video's description. Could it have been one of the guys who was a regular at the club? Absolutely. You had members and associates going in and out of that club every day. But why would they say the information came from an informant when there was none? There's only one answer that makes sense, and that's if the agents were being underhanded when requesting the judge issue permission for the bug. Keep in mind, we're talking about an old woman's apartment, not someone who's a criminal. So to get a judge to sign off on planting a bug would prove to be difficult. They can't just say we have a hunch that Gotti's using this woman's apartment, but by adding that a confidential informant told them would get the job done. I don't believe that they would let Gleason know that they were going on a hunch either. I believe both scenarios are plausible and absolutely don't rule out the informant possibility. Most likely, I doubt we'll ever know the true story. But if it was someone who gave the apartment up, it's probably considered the greatest piece of information received from an informant, because as a result, it became the nucleus for the government to finally convict John Gotti.